Hey, Tim Frisch with A Frisch Perspective here. I've been talking quite a bit recently about Pastor John MacArthur and Grace Community Church, and they actually brought a lawsuit against Governor Gavin Newsom and the government of California over government restrictions on meeting indoors, and they've actually continued to meet indoors in recent weeks and months in spite of the government restrictions. There's another church that is high profile that is now suing the government, and I just saw this recently. The first article I have here is from the Epic Times. It says, Capitol Hill Baptist Church sues D.C. Mayor, government for barring worship services. This is from September 24th, and it says that Senior Pastor Mark Dever and CHBC, Capitol Hill Baptist Church's elders, reluctantly filed suit against the edict in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia on September 22nd. Dever is a nationally known evangelical leader and the founder of the Nine Marks organization. So Mark Dever and the leaders of his church are suing the mayor of Washington, D.C. over the restrictions that they've put on churches, which I think are even more restrictive than what was out in California. I think they can't even meet outdoors with more than 100 people. I could be wrong on that, but it sounds like the restrictions in the Washington, D.C. area are really tight for churches. There's another article on the Washington Post that says prominent evangelical church is the first to sue D.C. over COVID-19 worship limits. This is by Michelle Borstein, September 22nd. It says a large prominent evangelical Capitol Hill church late Tuesday filed a legal challenge to the district alleging the city government is violating the First Amendment by facilitating and tolerating massive anti-racism protests, but forbidding worship services, indoor or outdoor, of more than 100 because of COVID-19. So there it is. You can't have more than 100 people meet, even outdoors. The complaint filed by the 850-member Capitol Hill Baptist Church is the first legal challenge by a religious organization to the Capitol's coronavirus restrictions. There have been two others in the region, one in Virginia and one in Maryland, since quarantine measures began, and final decisions are pending in both. The suit, filed in U.S. District Court, challenges the city's limits on worship generally, but asks specifically only for the right to meet outdoors. It notes that Bowser appeared at a huge anti-racism rally in June, that the city police have been assigned to such events, and that her office has not enforced its own ban on outdoor gatherings of more than 50 people. So again, we have a case here of government inconsistency, which I pointed out is the problem in California too. The church takes no issue with defendants' decisions to permit these gatherings, which are themselves protected by the First Amendment, and the church supports this exercise of First Amendment rights. The church does, however, take exception to defendants' decision to favor certain expressive gatherings over others, the suit said. And that sounds familiar because that's basically the case that Grace Community Church was also making. The First Amendment protects both mass protests and religious worship, but Mayor Bowser, by her own admission, has preferred the former over the latter. The suit comes at a complicated time for Capitol Hill Baptist, which offers online Bible study, lectures, and a journal, among other things, but no virtual worship. It says in its suit that worshiping together in person is required for a biblically ordered church. The 142-year-old, largely white conservative congregation has spent much of the year in intense internal conversation about racism, politics, the overwhelming white evangelical support for President Trump, and what it all means for the Christian witness. There have been church book groups discussing white privilege, and clergy members this week are launching a teaching series on how to remain close amid disagreements on race and politics, and that's all part of being in the Washington, D.C. area as a church. The vote Sunday at a members' meeting to pursue litigation was 402 in favor, 35 against, members said. Though church leaders would not confirm specific numbers, some pastors said no members were strongly opposed, but some were concerned, said Justin Sock, a lay pastor. Further down, the article says, in a statement, the Reverend Thomas Bowen, director of the Mayor's Office of Religious Affairs, said, "The pandemic has placed us all in a tough situation. leading us to make adjustments to all aspects of our lives. We have engaged with congregations to ensure houses of worship can plan their services in a way that it is safe for everyone. On Monday, Bowser said she was considering lifting bans on some activities during Phase 2. In the next 2 weeks, she said she might reopen city-owned indoor pools, allow more activities in libraries, and grant waivers for more activities at some businesses, such as live music. The city has been in Phase 2 for 3 months. D.C. has met some of its 10 criteria for moving into the next phase, including a coronavirus test positivity rate below 3% and the ability to contact almost every new patient within a day of testing positive, but has a ways to go in other areas. So these restrictions are really not just about churches, they're in other areas too. But as you can see, it's really hard for them to get to the next phase. They have really tight restrictions. Coronavirus restrictions are more liberal in Virginia and Maryland, though in Maryland the governor allows localities to be more restrictive. Further down, the article says Capitol Hill Baptist has been meeting for several months in a field outside a Virginia church. The motion said the church wants to negotiate with large outdoor venues to hold services, but can't if the city won't give it a waiver. So really, they're trying very hard to work with the city. They haven't actually been meeting indoors, but the city so far is not working with the church. The article closes by quoting Tim Walters, head of the group Reopen Maryland. He says, "The First Amendment doesn't give us a right to meet. It constrains Congress and the governor from getting into it," Walters said. "Scripture calls us to be in fellowship, and watching it on YouTube isn't fellowship." So now Capitol Hill Baptist has thrown its hat into the ring of this situation and is challenging government restrictions, particularly regarding the First Amendment right for churches to meet. And that's a very important point. It's true that there are other entities that are being restricted in this situation. However, other entities aren't being protected under the First Amendment the way that churches are. That being said, groups that meet for protests, for example, are actually protected by the First Amendment because we are allowed to peaceably assemble. And churches are allowed to peaceably assemble and also exercise freely their religion according to the First Amendment. So it's really good to see another church that's taking this stand. I was actually really encouraged by this. We see it over in California, but now we're seeing it in Washington, D.C. And one thought that came to my mind is how location matters. I've talked about this a little bit before, but your location definitely plays into how you see the situation and how the situation affects you. So in California, where MacArthur's church is, it's very hot in the summer. So them having to meet outdoors can be very difficult. Even if the government says, yeah, you're allowed to meet, you just have to meet outside. But you have to meet outside in California in the summer. Not necessarily the easiest thing. Well, Washington, D.C. can be a very cold place, and so Capitol Hill Baptist Church has to deal with the fact that they can meet outside, but when it starts to get really cold, it's going to be hard to meet outside. And so ultimately, they have to find a way to work with the government, first to be able to have groups outside of over 100, I think, but then eventually to be able to meet indoors is really, I think, where they want to go. So the temperature of your location makes a difference. Also, the way the government treats you makes a difference. And as you can see where Capitol Hill Baptist is, there have been very restrictive measures put in place by the government there. So that's really tough. I live in New Hampshire, and the government here is pretty hands-off. We do have a certain amount of guidelines given to churches, but I have to say the government isn't highly restrictive here, so that is really good. I'd love to hear what you think about all of this stuff in the comments below, but as always, please try to keep your comments positive and helpful to discussion. But thank you as always for listening to this report and what I have to say from a Frisch Perspective.